Welcome to all of you. Thank you for staying after votes. Yep. And the subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement for the purposes of the subcommittee's reauthorization of J family programming at the State Department. Now I'm going to recognize myself for an opening statement. And once again, thank you to the witnesses for coming and giving us your time and your expertise. Always welcome. So the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs, INL, acronym, the motto is security through justice. But unfortunately, for the last 4 years, they have been more interested in security through ideology, trading fight against narcotics for seminars to teach pronouns, and workshops on gender diversity. I believe that the result of this alien ideology has been damaging to our national security, especially in a region which is very close to my heart, Central America. As some of you know, I was the Central American Bureau Chief for Univision Network during the Civil War in El Salvador. I lived in that country for many years until 1992 when they signed a peace treaty. Central America, don't I know it, has suffered for decades, and this was the perfect time to help them. Let's go to Guatemala. Almost 9 million migrants passed through their territory trying to come to the United States in the last 4 years. The Guatemalans needed INL's assistance to tackle that human trafficking and narcotics. But unfortunately, the Biden administration refused to work with the Attorney General of that country because apparently she was too conservative. They sanctioned her. Her name is Consuelo Porras. I don't know her, but I do know that she is the head of Ministerio Público, which is for us, the United States, the Attorney General. Unfortunately, the previous administration refused to work with her. I believe that if the Guatemalans put her there, the Biden's bureaucrats don't have any business in telling her that she was not fit for the job. And they attacked her over and over again. This is the perfect definition of putting politics and ideology before safety and respect for our neighbors' political views. If the Guatemalans are conservative, well, so be it. We got to respect it. Let's talk now about El Salvador, the country which has been tackling a terrible gang problems for 30 years. I was about to be killed in few instances. I lived it, I know it. And things were terrible in El Salvador until President Bukele arrived in the picture. El Salvador should have been a perfect partner for the INL Bureau, which, by the way, it says that its mandate is to bring down transnational criminal organizations like MS-13 and Tren de Aragua. But instead of training the Salvadorian police forces, INL, Law Enforcement Academy, taught gender and inclusion as one of their main goals for El Salvador. I'm sure that at that moment, the Salvadorians were going to be saying the gringos have gone crazy. I am no law enforcement expert, but I am fairly confident that getting MS-13 to learn how to pronounce correctly pronouns is not going to dissuade them from committing any crimes. I am a witness. I have spoken to him that Bukele wants to work with the United States, but instead the Biden administration cut funds to the Salvadorian police by 50%. Why? And INL concentrated its budget for El Salvador to give it to NGOs that attack his security plan. With or without us, Bukele was successful. His strategy reduced one of the world's highest homicide rates to nearly zero. He presented this strategy to INL, and they said, no, we're not going to work with you. During the last 4 years, unfortunately, woke ideology has replaced common sense, but thankfully, things have changed under President Trump, and we're going to return the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs to its original mission, which is helping our allies fight crime, dismantling gangs, restoring law and order. They have a budget of $2 billion a year, and I think we owe it to the American taxpayers to commit and reestablish their mandate, finding drugs, stopping human trafficking, training police forces worldwide with American-made weapons bought by our allies. INL is one of the best tools we have as Americans to create a safer, stronger, and more prosperous country while helping our neighbors to do the same, whether it's in Central America or anywhere else in the world. I believe that we are still the United States. We're the point of reference for the rest of the hemisphere, at least when it comes to good governance, the beacon of hope, that there is a political system that respects human dignity. Thank God we're back on the right side of history. I yield back. And now I recognize my dear ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro, for any statements he may have.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Chairwoman, for convening this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying at this subcommittee's first hearing in this Congress. The topic of this hearing is broadly to discuss the reauthorization of the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement. This is certainly important, and I look forward to the discussion on this issue. But I first need to paint a picture of what's going on right now. In just the last few weeks, we've witnessed a deeply troubling pattern of executive overreach and undermining of congressional authority. The administration has attempted to dismantle congressionally established agencies, USAID, the Inter-American Foundation, and the U.S. African Development Foundation, all without a single hearing from this committee where the administration has defended its actions. The Trump administration is trying to shut down the U.S. Agency for Global Media, a move cheered by autocrats and dictators from Havana to Moscow to Beijing to Caracas. They're trying to do this without this committee, the full committee, demanding the administration even explain themselves. The committee has given up its role of oversight. It has abandoned any oversight of the Trump administration, which is astounding in the history of Congress. The committee has abandoned, we as a nation, because of the Trump administration, have abandoned brave human rights defenders in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and everywhere else in the world as we went back on our word and froze programs that support them. We left them to get rounded up and put in prison. That is what this administration has done. The committee has not called Secretary Rubio in or any other administration official to explain these actions. That's why I say they have abandoned any oversight responsibilities. Donald Trump has canceled temporary protected status and humanitarian parole for hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Cubans who have sought refuge in our country, as millions of people have over generations. These were people who had status to be here. This is after President Trump said that he would only go after criminals. Masked ICE agents are pulling people off the streets in Texas, in Florida, and in cities across our country, and sending them to prisons in El Salvador without any due process at all. President Bukele has become a mercenary for prisoners to house prisoners from the United States, and I imagine other parts of the world. Every day we learn of new horrors and innocent people brutalized by the administration. To do this, the Trump administration has used a wartime authority, the Alien Enemies Act, and claimed that we are being invaded by Venezuela. The idea that we're currently at war with Venezuela would be news to most Americans. In fact, it would be news to almost all Americans. If we're truly at war, I certainly think this committee should be holding a hearing on it. Unfortunately, what we're seeing from the Republican majority is a total surrender of their power as legislators. Why hasn't this committee demanded testimony from Secretary Rubio, Pete Morocco, and others on all of this? We need answers. We need accountability, and we need this committee to do its job. We meet at a time when the United States is facing serious, complex threats abroad, and the responses from this Congress and this administration have too often been silence, confusion, or political theater. Across the world, vital U.S. foreign assistance programs, many of them managed through the INL Bureau, have been cut, delayed, or outright canceled. We've seen freezes to police academy training in Mexico, programs designed to disrupt human trafficking, and efforts to equip law enforcement agencies across the globe with the tools to fight money laundering, fentanyl production, and organized crime. These aren't just line items in a budget. They're lifelines to communities here and abroad. The impacts of those decisions are not abstract. They absolutely make Americans less safe. When you see more fentanyl entering this country, when violent cartels operate with impunity, this is part of the reason why. These decisions will haunt us in the coming years. As we turn specifically to the reauthorization of the INL Bureau and its programs, we must approach reauthorization with clear eyes. INL has been a critical tool in our foreign policy toolkit, but I agree that it must evolve. Synthetic drugs like fentanyl are not only devastating American families, they're destabilizing entire regions. Scam centers and cyber-enabled fraud schemes are preying on our most vulnerable citizens. INL must be equipped and reoriented to tackle these challenges. At the same time, we must resist the impulse to think that security means police alone. Sustainable progress requires more than just training and equipping security forces. It means building robust justice systems, effective prosecutors, professional judges, strong defense attorneys, independent courts, prisons, and investing in the civil society actors who hold their leaders accountable. Funding police while defunding anti-corruption and rule of law programs is not just short-sighted, it's dangerous and it's counterproductive. Today's hearing is an opportunity to begin a serious, hopefully sober conversation about what INL needs to succeed and what reforms we need to pursue to ensure its work aligns with our values, advances our interests, and keeps our communities safe. Thank you, Chairwoman, and I yield back.
Thanks. Thank you, Mr. Castro. Thank you for your statement. And now we are pleased to have a distinguished panel of witnesses before us today on this important topic. Let me introduce Mrs. Chelsa Kenney. She's the Director, International Affairs and Trade for the United States Government Accountability Office. Thank you and welcome. Mr. Andres Martinez Fernandez, Senior Policy Analyst, Latin America, Allison Center for National Security at the Heritage Foundation. And Mr. Adam Isacson, Director for Defense Oversight, Washington Office on Latin America. And this committee recognizes the importance of the issues before us and is grateful to have you here to speak to us today. Your full statement will be made part of the record, and I will ask each of you to keep your spoken remarks to 5 minutes in order to allow time for members' questions. Now I recognize Ms. Kenney for her opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to discuss our findings and recommendations related to the Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs. INL contributes to some of the U.S. government's top security priorities. These include combating the flow of illicit narcotics into the U.S., promoting rule of law around the world, and combating transnational crime. We have reviewed many of INL's programs in recent years and identified successes as well as opportunities for improvement in at least 15 reports, many at the request of this committee. Since 2020, we have made 16 recommendations to improve the effectiveness of INL programs. I will highlight 3 key areas of improvement related to performance management, program monitoring, and program evaluation. First, we have made 5 recommendations to improve how INL is managing the performance of its projects. Of these, INL has implemented 1 recommendation on combating firearms trafficking in Mexico, but 4 related to firearms trafficking in the Caribbean and on assistance to Mexico more broadly remain unaddressed. Performance management is meant to ensure that the U.S. government is spending taxpayer dollars effectively and achieving U.S. goals. For example, since 2008, the U.S. has provided over $3 billion in assistance to Mexico to address crime and violence and enhance the country's rule of law. However, in 2023, we reported that INL could not demonstrate that it was achieving its goals because of gaps in its approach to performance management. Specifically, we found that INL had established goals and objectives but had not identified which of its projects were key to achieving them. So for example, under the goal of preventing trans-border crime, INL had established a joint objective with Mexico to disrupt and dismantle narcotics production. However, while INL implemented and collected data on individual projects, it had not linked which of these projects were helping to meet this goal. We recommended that INL strengthen its performance management approach to determine whether it was achieving its goals in Mexico. Considering the importance of the U.S.-Mexico relationship and the level of U.S. investment, we have identified this to be a priority recommendation for the agency. Second, we have made 6 recommendations to improve INL's program monitoring. Of these, INL has implemented 3, but 3 related to its wildlife trafficking programs remain unaddressed. Consistent program monitoring helps assess progress and identify problems that might prevent the Bureau from reaching its goals. Wildlife trafficking is a crime that fuels corruption and destabilizes communities. In recent years, media reports have alleged that park rangers, trained by U.S.-funded entities, had committed human rights abuses, including sexual assault and murder. Since 2020, state has taken steps to enhance safeguards to prevent these abuses. However, we found that INL had not conducted consistent program monitoring to ensure that these U.S.-funded entities reported on the implementation or effectiveness of these safeguards. We also found an alleged incident of sexual abuse by a ranger that INL was unaware of. INL agreed with our recommendations, including that it clarify reporting requirements for human rights abuses. Third, we've made 2 recommendations to INL to conduct program evaluations, or studies that would determine how well a program is working. For example, in 2024, we reported that despite years of support for activities to strengthen the security situation in Haiti, including specific efforts to improve the capacity of Haiti's national police, INL had no formal plans to evaluate the effectiveness of its activities. We recommended that INL conduct such an evaluation, and the Bureau agreed. INL plays a critical role in achieving U.S. security priorities, such as combating transnational crime and supporting rule of law worldwide. INL's effectiveness depends on robust performance management, program monitoring, and program evaluation. While INL has made some progress, important gaps remain. We urge INL to fully implement our recommendations to help ensure that it is spending taxpayer dollars effectively and achieving U.S. goals. Thank you, and I'd be pleased to respond to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Kenney. And now I recognize Mr. Martinez-Fernandez for his opening statement. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, and members for holding this hearing and inviting me to participate. The Western Hemisphere is experiencing a period of surging instability, violence, and criminality, largely driven by increasingly powerful criminal organizations. From Haiti's collapse at the hands of gangs, newfound narco violence in a once peaceful Ecuador, increasingly deadly drug cartels in Mexico and Colombia, and more, we are constantly confronted by evidence of a failed status quo for security in our hemisphere. These threats do not stay in Latin America. Instead, they drive increasingly deadly and destabilizing consequences to the United States and directly to the American people. The absence of robust and effective security engagement from the United States in Latin America is a key driver of the current state of affairs. Indeed, the collapse of the hemispheric consensus on counter-narcotics is due in no small part to decisions on the part of Washington to blunt and curb its security cooperation in the Americas away from the core support from regional security forces. This trend is driven in part by Washington's focus on other foreign conflicts, as well as a series of challenges that we continue to focus on in other parts of the world. However, the impact and inattention that this has brought has been exacerbated by mission drift and the watering down of critical institutions like the State Department's International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Bureau. Additionally, hemispheric security and stability has suffered from the Biden administration's politicization of U.S. security engagement and tools in Latin America. The so-called expert consensus on Latin America's security policy has shifted dramatically over the past 2 decades, prompting detrimental changes in the nature and magnitude of U.S. security cooperation. Vocal leaders and activists have successfully framed organized crime in Latin America as primarily being an issue of economic development and judicial institutions, de-emphasizing in particular the role of enforcement and security forces. Today, at the core of this new conventional wisdom in many circles in Washington and in the region is the increasingly the poorly substantiated claim that confronting Latin America's powerful criminal organizations only serve to exacerbate insecurity and criminality. One of the key events that provided support for this view was the spike in violence in Mexico during the late 2000s following President Felipe Calderón's efforts to crack down on the cartels. However, notably today, after over a decade during which the Mexican government has pulled back from confronting the cartels, Mexico's homicides rates now exceed the worst years of violence during the Calderón administration. Add to that the over 100,000 overdose deaths in the United States due to fentanyl and other deadly drugs. Indeed, Mexico's disastrous hugs not bullets strategy on the cartels showcases the dire consequences of de-emphasizing enforcement and security forces in our security policies in the Western Hemisphere. When President Andrés Manuel López Obrador with Mexico, the Merida Initiative drifted away from its initial focus of providing training, equipment, and operational support to Mexican security forces, and instead shifted support to, U.S. support shifted for reform of the Mexican judicial system increasingly. Then, when President López Obrador fully abandoned the Merida Initiative, the new security cooperation framework further de-emphasized security forces and the role of enforcement as a core aspect of security policy. In both Mexico, Colombia, and elsewhere, the United States failed to push back on regional leaders' abandonment of security cooperation and commitments. This was particularly egregious under the Biden administration, where we saw the increase of deaths of American people reaching 100,000 each year due to fentanyl and other drugs. And yet we did not adequately push the administration in Mexico to address the security threat posed by the cartels. Even worse, at times the Biden administration leaned into its wrong-headed approach within the region to, leaned into this wrong-headed approach on organized crime by regional leaders. In the case of Colombia, President Biden actively drew attention away from Colombia's deteriorating security situation by ending the long-standing program of U.S. monitoring of coca cultivation. To confront the dire threats posed by organized crime in our hemisphere, the U.S. security assistance through INL and other critical agencies should be bolstered and refocused on the core mission of counter-narcotics and transnational organized crime. Failure to do so urgently will bring increasingly deadly consequences for Latin America and for the American people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Martinez-Fernandez. I now recognize Mr. Isacson for his opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, thank you so much for holding this hearing and for inviting me. The State Department's Bureau of INL manages the largest U.S. aid account for security forces in Latin America and the Caribbean, though it pays for other things too. Worldwide, it's about $1.5 billion. In our hemisphere, it's at least $600 million. Now, for years, INL was jokingly known as the Drugs and Thugs Bureau. Its success was measured in hectares eradicated and kilos seized and kingpins arrested. That narrow focus reflects its 1980s era statute, and it hasn't really worked. You don't have to take my word for it. Just look at overdose deaths, look at street prices. Meanwhile, our understanding of organized crime and how to combat it has evolved. Yes, drugs are still a top revenue stream for criminal groups, but crime groups also make billions from gold mining, migrant smuggling, extortion, and more, sometimes with even bigger profits than they're getting from drugs. The drug market itself has shifted towards synthetics like fentanyl and meth, which don't involve most of Latin America outside Mexico. And mass migration has made the question urgent. How can we help people feel safe enough to stay in their own communities? This reframes success. It's no longer just kilos and hectares. It's whether people feel secure. It's whether justice works. It's whether officials fear punishment for corruption. To its credit, INL has shifted. It no longer tries to fight crime the way you'd fight a guerrilla insurgency. While guerrillas fight governments, organized crime infiltrates them and hollows them out by bribing, threatening, co-opting, and corrupting. That makes it a much harder, much more complex fight. Now, in response, INL has begun putting more emphasis on the L, rule of law, and civilian law enforcement, rather than just the N. Funding has increasingly gone to prosecutors, judicial institutions, police academies, oversight bodies, and independent experts and investigators. A whole comprehensive security sector, a table with many legs, and not just the people wearing uniforms. There's a growing realization that real progress is going to take time, and it depends on breaking collusion between government and crime. That's why efforts like the Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, the CICIG, mattered so much. Brave people made historic anti-corruption gains, and INL was there to support them. Ironically, de-narcotizing INL's mission may be the best way to reduce drug supplies in the long term. But that shift also means we need to rethink some obsolete frameworks like the annual drug certification process. As the 2020 Western Hemisphere Drug Policy Commission noted, it's a relic. It hasn't been used to seriously cut AIDS since the 1990s, and even then, a Republican majority Congress and a Democratic White House scrambled in the late 90s to restore it when security began deteriorating in Colombia. So yes, INL needs reform. WOLA supports a serious rethink to bring the Bureau and its statutes into the mid-21st century. What we don't support is a rushed 90-day review full of abrupt freezes and cuts with no input from partners around the world, many of whom have been risking their lives to fight corruption and crime and really depend on their relationship with us. The little we've seen of the proposed cuts so far is worrying. Aid to police and military agencies looks mostly untouched, but support to civil society, justice institutions, UN programs, that looks like it's cut by about half. That risks turning INL back into what it once was, a little drugs and thugs bureau. And we know where that leads. Brief dips in violence or drug supplies, followed by resurgence. It's just a constant game of whack-a-mole. Organized crime figures get taken down, but organized crime remains strong. Corrupt officials keep operating with impunity. People keep fleeing their homes, often coming here. I'm not asking to preserve the status quo. Frankly, I can't defend much of it because I can't see it. Public reporting on INL aid has become vague, inconsistent, and far less quantitative. It's hard to track where the money goes and what it achieves, and reporting requirements, if we do reauthorize INL, have to improve. That right now, oversight is difficult, and it makes the whole program hard to defend when an administration comes to power questioning its entire value. This committee can help. First, it can urge INL to keep expanding its focus on organized crime, corruption, and citizen security, not just counter-narcotics. Second, it can press for much better transparency. Third, it can insist that any reform effort be thoughtful, inclusive, and deliberate, not a 90-day rollback. There's lots of space for bipartisan agreement here, I think. I look forward to exploring that here and any other time that you'd like in the future. Thank you again for organizing this discussion.
And thank you, Mr. Isacson. And now for your testimony, I now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And I am delighted to hear, Mr. Isacson, that you believe certain quotes here that INL needs to be modernized, needs to be reformed, and that maybe they are just following some of the precepts of the 1980s. But specifically, I agree that they are not, that they need to be reorganized and there needs to be some revamped. But let's go to the last 4 years. Do you really believe that talking to the Guatemalans and to the Salvadorians about gender ideology or the pronouns or how that there are many genders, do you really think that talking to them was going to make the United States and themselves safer? Safer? I mean, you were going to keep people home? So explain how one thing comes to link to the other.
I would like to know what percentage of the program actually was about gender and identity and things like that. If it's, we don't have that data.
The main focus, the Guatemalans were complaining.
In terms of dollar amounts?
And of course, and in terms of political willingness and desire to infiltrate these forces with our ideology, the American Biden administration ideology. Don't you think that we did a disservice to them and to us?
If you're fighting human trafficking, where most victims are women,
Yeah.
you
How
need
can
the,
you be
more of a
talking
gender
about
focus. If
sex
you're
when you're
fighting
trying to
gender-based
fight human
violence,
trafficking? How do you
that's
do
true.
that?
I just need to know, how much of the programming really did go in that direction instead of like Joint Task Force Alpha in Guatemala,
Ask
which
the
was fighting human
Guatemalans.
smugglers.
The Guatemalans, perfect example. They hated a lady by the name of Consuelo Porras. Do I know her? No, I don't. But I know that she's the AG of the country, so why don't we work with her? Oh, because she's too conservative. Who are we to say that to the Guatemalans? Why?
I don't know if Consuelo Porras
Oh,
is
no,
hated.
it's quote. Everything I'm saying is quoted. Consuelo Porras is detested.
Oh, I think she is detested.
It was
Yeah.
okay. Well, but who are we, the Americans, to come and say, oh, Consuelo is not the person that you need to work with? She's the AG.
I've never heard that she was held at arm's length because she favored free markets or
She was too
because she was
conservative.
conservative. It's because of
Too
significant
conservative.
corruption, according to what I saw.
You know what I'm telling you. So please help me understand why the Biden administration wanted to concentrate its resources when it talks to reforming and securing the Salvadorian Guatemalan police, concentrated on something that had nothing to do with national security for the United States.
My impression was that INL and the Justice Department worked very hard with, not with Consuelo, but with the rest of the public ministry in Guatemala on something called Joint Task Force Alpha, which was a big effort to get at the nodes of the network of migrant smuggling. And they've actually taken out a lot of migrant smugglers, working with the Attorney General's office in Guatemala in the last few years. And the Trump administration is expanding
did
that.
you know this, would give money to the NGOs in Guatemala to help the migrants have a smoother ride while they were going through Guatemala and getting to Mexico.
I think that would have been illegal in Guatemala, where they actually arrest and deport more than 20,000, 30,000 migrants a year back into Honduras.
9 million went through it. All right,
Yeah, a
so
lot do
let's
get
go.
through.
Let's go to El Salvador. Bukele, what do you think? What ranking do you give to Bukele from 1 to 10?
I would give him a 4, perhaps. I think he's a brilliant communicator, but I do worry about checks
What
and
about the
balances.
communicator? What has he done with the country?
He has put 3% of the male population in prison, which, by doing so, did eradicate, for now, a lot of the gangs.
And
do
you
worry
and
about
I
the future
agree
of
that if there is
democracy.
one innocent guy in the Sicot, I was the first one who told him, you got to get him out because we don't want innocent people in jail. But the thing is that, Sicot is full of people who are full of tattoos that are revealing who they were and what they did. Each drop meant one murder. So do you think he did something right?
If these people were facing judges, and if their families knew what was going on with them, it would be right. But right now, almost everybody there is pretrial, and there's not even dates for most of their trials. So yeah, they need a fair shake. I mean, it was right to
I agree with
clean
you
out the
that
streets.
everyone needs due process. Yes, sir.
And that's just not happening right now.
All right, but what about us working with him? And maybe if INL would have done its job, then Bukele would have been able to really help. We would help him to do a better job, don't you think? Talking about diversity and inclusion and pronouns.
I think one of INL's biggest obstacles actually there is, and I actually support it, is language that both Republicans and Democrats put in the foreign aid bill saying that half of aid, I believe it's half, to El Salvador is cut until they can certify that the human rights situation is good and is improving. And right now, more than 300 people dying in the jails in the last 3 years and widespread allegations of torture. It's been hard to certify that.
What happens to the human rights of the people who were outside being killed by those gang members, which is why he got 90% of transparent and internationally observed elections. We agree with that,
Oh, yeah,
right?
if I was a
The
shopkeeper being
Salvadorians love the
extorted.
guy, so why do we have to hate him? Who are we to say to this guy, don't do it that way?
I think we're just worried about what it's going to look like in 5 years. But yeah, right now, if I'm a shopkeeper who had to pay...
Don't you think that they should be concerned about what they're going to be looking like 5 years from now? That's their concern, not ours. We're here to help them have a better police force. All right? Do you agree with that, right?
We're certainly here to help them have a better police force, but we don't want to be funding abuses in the short term.
I think that I'm exceeding my time. I yield back. Now I'm going to recognize the ranking member for 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Chairwoman. Yeah, I want to take up this issue really quickly because, we disagree, Maria, on this. I don't think there's ever been a bias of the United States against conservative leaders and in favor of leftist leaders. In fact, when you look at the history of the U.S. involvement in Latin America has often, I mean, the United States, unfortunately, in decades past, worked to undermine the leadership of leaders on the left and treated leaders on the right as friends. And in fact, supported what were some of the most brutal dictatorships, like the Pinochet ruling in Chile. And so, when we think about how we provide U.S. assistance, how we provide taxpayer money, the way we should be thinking about it is who is operating consistent with U.S. values and what we stand for. So democracy, freedom, respect for human rights. Really, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, whether you're on the left or the right as a leader, we ought to support leaders who are pursuing those things. And so Consuelo Porras, as I understand, had been sanctioned for severe corruption. That's why we're not working with her, not because she's got a certain ideology. And Bukele also, I think it's true. I mean, he has gotten a lot of crime off the streets and has scared a lot of people, especially young men. But so has Xi Jinping in China. And so, if the question is, well, why don't we just let people do what they're going to do? Okay, I get that. But the question for us is, are we going to back them up with money to commit human rights abuses and other things that we would never allow for in the United States ourselves? Now, bear in mind, in the last few weeks, we've seen some disturbing instances of people literally been picked off the street for having exercised their First Amendment rights by government agents who don't identify themselves, who aren't dressed in uniform, and who barely present credentials, if at all. Those are the kinds of activities that you're used to seeing in countries that violate people's rights. So just, with that disagreement, let me get into a question really quick. Ms. Kenney, as you know, the administration is conducting multiple reviews of foreign assistance programs, and I believe those programs have been incredibly disruptive and that the review has not been done in good faith. In 2019, the first Trump administration did something similar on a smaller scale. They unilaterally froze $400 million in foreign assistance funding in Central America for over 14 months. At the time, I, along with other colleagues, requested the GAO assess the impacts of that freeze. The GAO determined that many programs, including State Department INL bureau programs, had been adversely affected. And based on your experience with the 2019 freeze, do you expect adverse effects from the ongoing freeze on many INL programs?
Thank you for that question. Yes, when we reviewed the freeze in 2019, we found that there were a number of adverse effects. To the State Department, we found that about 65 or 39% of INL programs actually suffered adverse effects, where they had to reduce the geographical region in which they were implementing programs. They had to reduce the number of beneficiaries who could participate in trainings. They had to reduce the quality of programs. And programs that relied on implementing partners suffered even more consequences because they had to lay people off and they were unable to pick up those programs when the funding resumed. However, that funding was really just a freeze of one-year funding, and in a lot of ways, those programs were able to continue because of funding that was still available in the pipeline from prior year's funding. We haven't had an opportunity to review the funding freeze that is occurring right now, but my understanding is that those programs aren't able to access prior year funding either, and so my understanding is that they're not continuing at all. We haven't had. I'm sorry.
Sure, no, and thank you for that. And let me ask a follow-up really quick. Will the GAO be willing to conduct a review of the ongoing freeze and cancellation of hundreds of millions of dollars in foreign assistance programs?
Yes, we'd be happy to do that work.
Thank you so much. With that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member Castro, and now give the opportunity to Representative Lawler from the state of New York.
Thank you, Chairwoman. It's common practice for transnational criminal organizations in South and Central America to source precursor chemicals from China and synthesize illicit substances like fentanyl. These criminal organizations then traffic them into the United States, where they have infiltrated far too many communities and led to unimaginable tragedies for a lot of families across our nation. 70,000 Americans are dying on an annual basis from fentanyl overdose. Mr. Martinez-Fernandez, how do you assess INL's role in stopping the influx of deadly fentanyl into the United States?
Well, clearly, INL and the U.S. government is not adequately acting either on resources or focus to stop the flow of fentanyl. As you mentioned, over 70,000 just overdose death just from fentanyl. When you add in all the other illicit drugs, 100,000. And so I think there's a very real resource question that has to be addressed. There's also a partnership and cooperation side to that, where our relationship with Mexico, particularly over the past 4 years under the Biden administration, security cooperation was almost non-existent. They even offers to support port security to identify fentanyl precursors coming in were rejected by the Mexican government. And the challenges of migration, which grew out of control under the Biden administration as well, led to a deprioritization, in my opinion, of the fentanyl threat with dire consequences. Now, President Trump has obviously rallied significant resources, particularly from the Department of Defense to the border. I think that's an important aspect of the confronting this threat. But we also need to press the Mexican government to take action. And there's also certainly the administration is making progress on that front and bringing to bear some economic tools. I think INL is going to play an important role because at some point we need to restore the security relationship with Mexico to a functional arrangement with actually targeting the cartels rather than just having symbolic actions by the Mexican government be the sum total of the relationship, which is essentially what we've seen for the past 4 years.
So what can INL do to address China's role related to the precursor chemicals that are exported into Mexico and other parts of the Western Hemisphere?
So I think certainly with the Chinese presence in Mexico is also significant. So that there's action to go after some of the brokers as well as some of the trade infrastructure, which is utilized by the Chinese in Mexico to facilitate the flow of illicit precursors. I think that more action also needs to be done in Asia on this front. We've seen movement of illicit fentanyl supply chains even out of China. Unfortunately, we don't have a cooperative relationship on this issue with the government in China. So there are significant limitations on INL's ability to act there. But I think ensuring that in Mexico in particular, we're confronting the presence of Chinese criminal organizations, as well as further south. We've already seen in countries like Guatemala the movement of these illicit supply chains of fentanyl to new countries, and we need to make sure that we're reinforcing border security, port security, and those security relationships to make sure that it doesn't just migrate to another country.
In what way is the INL working with other entities within the U.S. government, like the DEA, on this particular issue, and how can they improve upon that to really crack down on this? Obviously, we have a demand issue in this country that is part of the problem of the deadly flow of fentanyl.
Yeah. So I think there is some important cooperation with other agencies, particularly the Department of Homeland Security, on the issue of border security within the region and ensuring that regional partners can have those capacities to ensure that those flows don't move through their country without their ability to intercept them. And on the U.S. side and the demand side that you referred to, I think as I understand it, there's some conversations happening here in Congress about potential changes as far as consequences, judicial consequences in the United States, that are going to align, I think, the reality of the threats and the deadliness of this this drug with the consequences that people face.
Thank you, Representative Lawler. And now I give the word to Representative Stanton of the state of Arizona. You have
Thank you very much.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. The fentanyl crisis is especially acute in my home state of Arizona, where thousands of Arizonans die from opioid overdose every single year. I know my colleagues and I across the aisle agree. We need to do more to stop the flow of fentanyl and other deadly narcotics into the United States of America. That's why I'm at a loss to understand why the Trump administration has moved to cut funding for the State Department's Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement Affairs work in Mexico. Drastic cuts. INL works across law enforcement agencies, intergovernmental agencies, and with the courts in our partner countries to disrupt the illicit drug trafficking and bring criminals to justice. Under previous administrations and with funding approved in a bipartisan manner, Mexico has been the third largest recipient of INL funds. INL supports more than 100 projects working to combat fentanyl trafficking and transnational crime by providing services, training, and much-needed equipment. One project that has benefited from the INL has deployed cargo scanners and drug testing equipment to Mexico's port of Manzanillo, critical technology to detect and interdict precursor chemicals from the People's Republic of China. Another INL project supported a recent operation in Tucson, Arizona, that led to the arrest of drug trafficking leader and 6 other operatives, a good return on taxpayer investment. Since the Trump administration's freeze on foreign aid, only 15% of INL's programs in Mexico have received waivers to resume their work, and many of those have not yet received payment. As former ambassador and Marine helicopter pilot John Feely phrased it recently, quote, "They shot the golden goose right in the leg," unquote. Make no mistake about it. The Trump administration is hamstringing our response to fentanyl in the region, and while using this crisis as a justification to raise taxes on working families through the misguided across-the-board tariffs on Mexico. Mr. Isacson, how does this massive cut to INL program hamper our ability to stem the flow of fentanyl into the United States?
It definitely deals a blow to our efforts against fentanyl. This is the hardest drug challenge we've ever faced. All pure fentanyl that's consumed in the United States in a year can fit in the beds of 2 or 3 pickup trucks, spread out across a 2,000-mile border. Unfortunately, about 2/3 of it coming right to your state right now. In order to fight this, it's not just a matter of scanners at the border. You need cooperation from Mexico on everything you named: investigators, prosecutors, ports, intelligence, all capital letters. And you cut that off in 90 days and then maybe restart it, you have to restart everything all over again. It's incredibly disruptive.
I appreciate that. Now, I have, in my time in public life, both here in Congress and formerly as mayor of Phoenix, Arizona, have been a friend of Mexico, making the case that we need to have a stronger economic unit between United States, Mexico, Canada, and that's how we're going to win this economic battle with China. As a result, I've been a critic of the recent judicial reforms in Mexico, which I think is a step backwards in terms of promoting U.S. investment in Mexico. INL has helped to train Mexican institutions to build and present strong legal cases against organized crime. Mexico's forensic labs and prisons are accredited to reach higher standards for forensic testing due to INL support. U.S. officials helped to train police investigators in Mexico City, reducing violent crime in Mexico City by 58% in partnership with now President Sheinbaum. And INL support helped Mexico law schools update their curriculums to include Mexico's criminal law reform. These offices that train police and prosecutors and relied on INL funds are now cut drastically by the dismantling of foreign assistance. So another question from Mr. Isacson. You hosted a podcast last October about Mexico's constitutional reforms, where you opened by saying, quote, "The promise to be serious setbacks in the struggle to hold powerful people and institutions accountable for corruption. How do Mexico's constitutional changes, including reorganization of National Guard and judicial reforms, concern you? Maybe you could go on a little bit. For those who haven't listened to your podcast, go on a little bit more about the threat of the constitutional reforms.
Sure, and I hope you call in my colleague who runs our Mexico program, Stephanie Brewer, who really knows this stuff. But they just changed their judiciary so that judges are now popularly elected. Like, people are going to come and vote for a long list of judges. A justice system, especially when they're working on these very complicated, very dangerous cases against these networks of corruption and powerful people who are willing to kill them, need to be free of political pressures and need to be autonomous. And this just dealt a strong blow to that. As well as substituting police and detectives and people who are in the community with National Guard troops who rotate in and out, that also makes it harder to actually, you can find crimes when they're happening, but you can't really get to the root of who is behind them.
Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. I now recognize Representative Shri of the state of Arizona.
Representative Shri, Madam Chairwoman, is from the state of Indiana and is happy to be here.
Or state of Indiana, I'm sorry. Not even a downgrade, no. And Indiana is one of.
Madam Chair, we agree. I thank the witnesses for being here, and I have a question that, in fairness, I'll address to Ms. Kenney, because I wasn't in the room to hear the testimony from our other witnesses, but I appreciate all of you sharing time and expertise with us. Of course, INL defines its core mission as keeping America safe by countering crime, illegal drugs, and instability abroad. We recognize that America is vulnerable to external threats, certainly including narcotics. We recognize that on both sides of the aisle. In my view, the Trump administration is demonstrably making headway in securing our border and curbing some of the trafficking that was making its way up I-65 and across I-70 in Indiana, particularly on the fentanyl trafficking. We are seeing headway palpably within the district that I represent. The most pressing drug-related threats in my part of the country would stem from the trafficking efforts of the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco cartel. These organizations, I am informed in part by some of the county sheriffs that I represent, dominate the wholesale supply of illicit opioids, particularly fentanyl and heroin, in and through my district. The crisis is personal to me. I have friends and constituents who have lost loved ones to fentanyl poisoning. And this must continue to be a bipartisan priority. And Mr. Stanton had to step out, but I do think that this is a bipartisan priority. Since 2008, INL has overseen some $3 billion in funding for security, counter narcotics, and rule of law programs in Mexico. And Mr. Isacson, you talked about the abrupt curtailing of some of that. There were a few GAO reports of late highlighting gaps in INL's metrics and monitoring, raising concerns about the effectiveness of these programs. Certainly, the administration is attuned to those. The GAO report concluded, without fully addressing the key elements for assessing progress, the U.S. government cannot be assured that it is achieving its security goals in Mexico and that its investments at over $3 billion since 2008 are being spent effectively. So I'll direct my question to the witness that I heard from in her testimony, though invite anyone else that may have expertise to respond. Ms. Kenney, what lessons should INL take away from the GAO evaluation of its programs in Mexico that can be used to inform our future initiatives, our future investment in this cause?
Thank you for this question. We reviewed the effectiveness, the results of the Merit Initiative and the Bicentennial Framework. We did our work sort of at a time period that straddled both of these strategies. And we looked to see what were the results of the $3 billion plus investment that the U.S. had made in Mexico. And what we found is that there were key elements of INL's performance management approach, if you will, that limited our ability to really evaluate its effectiveness. So in these strategies, both Merida and the framework, the Bicentennial Framework, we found that they had established those top-level goals and objectives, and that they had a number of individual projects and activities that address things like counter-narcotics flows, fentanyl flows, and they're tracking data on the implementation of all of these activities. They had not identified which of these activities were critical, which were the ones that were really critical to being able to assess the effectiveness of these top-line goals. They just hadn't identified the indicators and then monitored to align them to be able to say, this suite of activities is going to demonstrate our progress in achieving this goal. When we talked to the State Department about what were the challenges in being able to complete this, because this went back to the Merit Initiative, which started in 2008, they said that that the U.S. government was working with the Mexican government to come up with some shared set of indicators. These strategies are designed to be sort of shared approaches, both for the U.S. and Mexican government, to be able to address these shared issues, shared challenges, and that there were some challenges in being able to develop a common set of indicators. And some of the complicating factors were, at the time, new administrations both in Mexico and the United States. However, we would point out that given the level of investment and given the continuity of these challenges, it's really important that the State Department figure out what these indicators are, figure out what these suite of activities should be to be able to support those top-line goals and be able to measure and share the effectiveness of those efforts going forward. So that is really our recommendation. Our recommendation should be identified as a priority recommendation for the State Department. Of all of the recommendations that we make, we believe this is one of the most critical ones to be able to really make progress on the individual activities and efforts to be able to address this critical issue between U.S. and Mexico.
Ms. Kenney, I appreciate it very much, and my time has expired. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Shri of the state of Indiana. I appreciate your time with us, and now I'm going to recognize Representative Jackson of the state of Illinois for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Representative Salazar. Thank you, Ranking Member. Colombia is the regional leader in coordinating the multinational operation Campaign Orion, a naval campaign focused on dismantling the transnational network of drug trafficking and related crimes. During the 13th edition of the Orion Naval Campaign last year, operations in which 125 institutions in 62 countries from Africa, the Americas, Asia, Europe, and for the first time, Oceania participating forces seized more than 400 tons of drugs. Thanks to the exchange of intelligence and the culmination of capabilities to counter the illicit trafficking of drugs and other illegal activities linked to narco trafficking. I must say that was a very diverse network. It had a high level of intelligence being interchanged, and they had shared interests. They had equity amongst all participants. DEI does work. So I don't know where we get off on this tangent that makes no sense to me on diversity is bad. Diversity and equity is in quite a few constitutions around the world. We're going through a temporary period of some insanity to act as if e pluribus unum. Out of many, we are one in the Americas. I'd like to let it be for the record that 2/3 of our hemisphere and population is not in the United States, and we are one contiguous land mass. The operations reached record figures in narcotics seized, reducing the supply worldwide and dealing significant blows to the finances of multi-crime organizations, preventing them from receiving more than $18.7 billion, according to the Colombian military forces. Authorities seized a total of 402 tons of solid chemical precursors and 1.6 million liters of liquid chemical precursors and destroyed 302 illegal infrastructures used for the extraction and processing of drugs. The Colombian Navy reported the 112 boats seized and 211 vehicles and on and on. Since this program started about 7 years ago, with only narco trafficking, the Orion 12 have included other crimes that are present in the maritime land domain as well, such as arms and migrant smuggling, trafficking, money laundering, and the like. The 13th edition of the Orion Naval Campaigns have consolidated it as the most important and influential international cooperation strategy in the global fight against narco trafficking, and has also managed to transcend in time thanks to innovation and rapid adaptation to respond to this highly complex and changing phenomenon. Once again, I want to thank each of you for coming, and this question will go to you, Mr. Isacson, and thank you for your outstanding service as well. What is the impact of aid cuts in this program, such as Orion Naval Campaigns?
Well, the main impact has been that the Colombian National Police, in its part of the effort to interdict cocaine, has had some real disruptions. Even many of their Black Hawk helicopters were grounded for a while because they didn't have money for maintenance or fuel. Trainings have been disrupted, and just the intelligence that you need in order to maintain this level of interdictions has been disrupted. I don't know for how long, because I just don't have the information for how long it's been cut off and whether decisions have been made to give waivers. And if so, is that going to mean a few blank months this year where the level of interdiction dips, which has been at record levels, or whether they're going to be able to recover that? But we'll find out soon. So
do you think that the money that might have been saved theoretically will come back to be a penny saved and a dollar foolish?
I think so, because it's not good government practice to stop all of your programs for 90 days and then just selectively restart them. Your partners just don't work like that, and it may cost them months and months, if not a couple of years, to really recover from that, even if they do get to keep the level of funding they had before.
Well, thanks so much. So you're saying the whiplash, the backlash, the frenetic, the hectic pace, this capitulation, this erratic behavior is bad for our long-term goal of reducing the drug trafficking in our region?
It was definitely good for the organized crime groups who wanted to evade the police and the Navy and others in Colombia.
I yield back. I thank you so much.
Thank you, Representative Jackson. And now I'm going to recognize Representative Titus of the state of Nevada for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member. Mr. Isacson, would you go over this for me just again very simply? What was the justification given by President Trump for levying tariffs against Mexico?
The main justification was that Mexico wasn't cooperating enough in stopping fentanyl coming to the United States.
Right. And now that the president is threatening a trade war with Mexico, has that compelled greater cooperation from their authorities on this issue?
I guess if Mexico thinks they can stop the tariffs, then they will come up with some seizures and they'll bomb some labs and things like that. But it won't help with things like complex investigations and intelligence now.
So it really hasn't moved that
No, and if
ball.
the tariffs happen, then what incentive does Mexico have once their economy is cratering to keep cooperating?
And that's part of the problem. Will they happen? Will they not?
Right.
On what products? How much? What percent? That sort of thing.
Right.
Well, will cuts to the INL programs in Mexico help or hurt our ability to stem the flow of fentanyl into the country?
Yeah, I mean, I was saying this before. You can't just have better scanners at the border and hope or bomb a few labs. It costs $60,000 to start a new fentanyl lab. You need a lot of the things that INL does, which is building intelligence, building port security programs, canine, courts, all this other stuff so that you can stop the whole network that's doing this rather than just try to stop it at a scanner on the border. And if you disrupt INL programs, you're disrupting that very, very, very important ingredient in the fight.
So it's working counter to what you claim is the purpose of the tariffs and other dealings with Mexico.
Threatening your partners, really taking away their incentive to cooperate while freezing and restarting and halting and putting waivers and confusing the programs that you are running is obviously not going to be helpful. It's going to be helpful maybe to the people producing fentanyl.
So in the meantime, in addition to the tariffs, can you talk about the effect of the Trump administration's prioritizing arbitrary mass deportations over things like root causes of terrorism, transnational crime, drug trafficking, human trafficking, weapons trafficking, et cetera.
Yeah, I mean, the Trump administration is trying to do mass deportation with the existing people they have, right? Like 5,500 ICE enforcement and removal officers, which means where are they going to get the manpower? They're taking it from DEA, they're taking it from DOJ, everything, Bureau of Prisons. ICE, HSI, Homeland Security Investigations, these are the agencies that are supposed to be working on these drug cases, as well as cases, everything from child pornography to human trafficking. They're all being devoted to rounding up migrants now, often even migrants without criminal records. And it's a really, really disastrous diversion of our law enforcement resources.
So could you sum that up by saying that it's made us less safe, not more safe?
Yeah, I mean, if you, I would put it this way, if you are a fentanyl trafficker or a child pornographer or something like that, you are feeling less pressure from federal law enforcement since January 20th because of this diversion of resources.
Because they're focused somewhere else and you can get away perhaps.
Yeah, they're
with
focusing
this.
on migrants. And if you're not in the migrant smuggling business, you have less to worry about.
So if we're going to impose tariffs on Mexico, that's going to be a tax on families in my district.
Sure.
People in Nevada are going to pay more out of pocket. If you don't have money in your pocket, you can't go on holiday. People won't be coming to Las Vegas for a holiday.
Mm-hmm.
Certainly if you're from Canada or Mexico, you're not going to be as likely to come as a tourist, and that's our main source of tourism. And at the same time, what we're doing is undercutting our response to the flow of fentanyl. Does that pretty much summarize the problem?
Yeah, I
Or
mean,
the situation?
the arguments against tariffs are pretty strong economically here at home, but also, yeah, I mean, if you are a Mexican government official, even one who really believes in this fight, what's your incentive to cooperate if you're being punished without even any clear benchmarks or guidelines about how to stop the punishment? And the same goes for fentanyl, as well as working against migrant smuggling through Mexico too. You're just, what's going to push you to work harder to do the Americans a favor and work harder in together on this if you already have a 25% tariff on all of your goods?
All right. Well, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Titus. And now we are going to start a second round of questioning, not too long, and I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes. We all agree that we want to revamp and make INL a better agency. We all agree with that. And I wanted to tell my respected ranking member that what the Trump administration is doing is trying to cut waste and on important programs like INL. And because INL funded hip-hop classes in Guatemala. I go back to things that they should not be doing. We all agree that we have to cooperate with Mexico and that we have to help the Guatemalan police force and El Salvador. And by the way, one of the things I also wanted to, and I want to talk to three of you, is I'm not going to just hone in on Mr. Isacson. We decertified El Salvador, INL decertified El Salvador as a partner, which led to the cuts in funds. These are the things that I don't understand. Why? Because you think that Bukele may not be ideologically aligned with the State Department. Why are you going to do that? And the same thing with Guatemala. I'm just stating what I think it's common sense. Right now, in Latin America, projects that prove to be effective are back online. For instance, targeting systems in Mexico and Peru that provide intelligence on foreign passengers and cargo. Dogs in Costa Rica. All right, so my question to Mrs. Kenney. Since you are an impartial force in this hearing, tell me in very simple terms, for those people who are at home that do not want to spend taxpayers' money in things that are futile, like hip-hop classes in Guatemala, in which way that $2 billion that we give INL every year, where do you think should be spent? Give it to me in 30 seconds, like a good television soundbite. So people back at home will say, okay, INL should be back on track. Tell me.
So based on our review of the INL programs,
Yes.
what we have found is that there are some consistent patterns in terms of implementation. GAO would not identify the policy choices that INL should make, but we are happy to talk to you about the effectiveness of the implementation. And what we have found consistently is that there are opportunities to improve performance management, ensuring that the activities that you are funding are meeting your strategic goals. We saw it in Mexico, we saw it in firearms trafficking, we saw it in efforts in the Caribbean, making sure that the specific activities that you're funding are linking up and actually helping you achieve your goal. We
And
saw
why
even-
do you think that happens? So what you're telling me basically is that I am going to do this, but I'm not sure if it's being effective or not, but I'm going to put the money behind it anyway. Is that what you're telling me? So why do you think that happened, and how can that be changed? Why did it happen?
Well, I think our recommendation is that the State Department figure out how to create that alignment, that these activities should be funded to the overall strategic goals. I think in Mexico, what we heard is that there was some effort to coordinate with the Mexican government, which is a good idea. However, we had been funding the Merit Initiative since 2008, and the administrations were going to change, so that was something that needed to be done. I think when we looked at firearms trafficking and we found similar programs or similar issues, we found that everyone would tell us that firearms trafficking in the Caribbean, in the Central America, in Mexico, that these were important U.S. goals. But when we asked about where the metrics were, how they were measuring effectiveness, it didn't show up. They didn't have firearms trafficking as one of their performance measures, so they weren't able to track it and demonstrate progress. It didn't show up in their strategies. So it's just important that whatever it is you decide your strategy, whatever your goal is, you need to be sure that your activities are aligned with it and that you're able to track and align those up to be sure that you're achieving the goals that you want to achieve.
So I'm sure the State Department is listening to you. Now, let me ask you, let's go to Mexico, and maybe we can talk to Mr. Fernandez or Mr. Isacson. Mexico is a very important ally. It's our next door neighbor. We've got to work with them because no one is going to move, right? So we're going to stay where we are, and so are they. I remember that under AMLO, Mexico, President Trump had a very good relationship with President AMLO, who had a completely different ideology than President Trump, and that AMLO sent 37,000 troops to the southern borders with Guatemala. That worked very well. All of a sudden, they cooperated. So why did that stop? And what incentives we're giving now Shane Baum, who comes from that same Morena party? I hear that relationships are good between both governments. So what can they really do? And in which way we could help them do it? And do they have the political willingness to receive money from the United States? And we know that, it's like we are neighbors, but we are not necessarily love each other, but we got to live with each other. Correct? Am I right in my assessment? We start with you, Mr. Fernandez. What can we do?
Yeah, I think it's important to your question about whether they will receive that assistance. I think that goes to the core of the issue.
Will they receive the assistance?
They have rejected a significant amount of
What have they
assistance in the past.
rejected?
I think because there are issues with corruption, there's issues with nationalism as well, and I mean we tried, I think, very clearly under the Biden administration to not pressure and do a
Be
positive
respectful.
engagement, as was alluded to by my colleague here, but obviously it didn't result in anything substantive as far as countering the fentanyl threat. It only expanded more greatly.
But explain it to me simply. What happened during those 4 years once, why so much fentanyl was able to come through? What did the Mexican government should have done that didn't do? And what can they do now under Shane Baum?
I think
Simple.
What happened over the past 4 years is we stopped pressuring them. And
Stop pressuring them.
Yeah, and that's
What
something that we're-
pressures we should have
Economic
implemented.
pressure, I think, is certainly the most potent that we have in the bilateral relationship with trade and the USMCA.
Stop right there. You see, Mr. Isacson, so then I agree that tariffs are bad for our constituents. I get it. But then what other tool do we have as a country to send the message to our neighbors that we need help because we don't want any more American kids dying?
Prosecutorial cooperation, intelligence cooperation. From 2023 to 2024, there was a 22% decrease in fentanyl seizures at the border. So far this year, it's down another 23%. Less seems to be being produced in Mexico, I think because of better cooperation. This may be premature, but no one's declaring victory, but there has actually been progress in the last 2 years.
But that's very little progress. We had 100,000 kids dying every year.
And deaths, thank goodness, are down about 30%.
The concussion and the chemicals are put together in Mexico.
Yeah, I agree.
Right, and we just passed legislation that the Congress voted for where we are giving money so we can destroy those precursors before they get composed into the little pill and our kids die. So I'm saying, what I'm trying to look is political. Do we have political willingness? Shane Baum, does she have political willingness to really work with us? We want to work with her.
I think Scheinbaum does. I'd be worried about people at the state level in Mexico. I'd be worried about corrupt military and police people.
So they have her own. She has her own swamp.
Yeah, she does have a swamp that she has to clean up, as does their judicial system. And
Thank you.
INL can help.
All right. Thank you. Yield back. Now I recognize Ranking Member Castro from the wonderful state of Texas for 5 minutes.
There you go.
Got it.
All right. All right. With respect to effective and serious and thoughtful cutting of waste, fraud, and abuse in government, I don't think it's going to be carried out by this DOJ committee that is being led by folks who have absolutely no expertise in this area, by 22-year-olds and 20-year-olds with the nickname of Big Balls. They're not going to accomplish what we're trying to accomplish here. They have no background in any of this, hardly any life experience, quite honestly. And more than that, they're keeping all of their work secretive. In fact, Elon Musk, as I recall, threatened the press that he would file suit or said that it was illegal if they just identified who these people were that are making these massive decisions about how our government operates. And that's not fair to the American people. It's not fair to American taxpayers to have a secret group in charge of what's going on in government that won't show its face at the United States Capitol. And even more than that, a majority party in Congress that isn't even asking them to show up, isn't even demanding that they show up and account for the work that they're doing. That's where we are right now. I hope that everybody in the full committee of this dais, when we have our full committee meetings, will join me and others in asking Elon Musk and those responsible for cuts to INL, cuts at the State Department, USAID, to come here and present to us their work. I mean, we can't even get a clear answer of what percent of INL, for example, is being cut. And that applies to other agencies and bureaus as well. So why doesn't this full committee ask Elon Musk to come and sit in these chairs, as our three witnesses have today, and explain the cuts that have been made and why they've been made? The one person that we had come, as I recall, Pete Morocco, whose job title is now changed, he came and I don't know who insisted, I don't know if the committee insisted or he and his people insisted that it not be a public hearing, that it be a closed door, private briefing, and instead of having 5 minutes to ask questions, we had like 2 or 3 minutes to ask questions. It's just bizarre. This is the United States government, and we're running our country right now. The country's being run like these countries that we've been critiquing for decades and decades by people who are doing secretive things, not transparent. And so, look, I agree that that's why you have a GAO. That's why you have inspectors general. And could we do more than that? Yeah, I think that we could do more than that. I think we should do more than that. And we do need to make adjustments because things do get stale and, and need to change. And Maria, you and I was your Democratic co-lead on that fentanyl bill on precursors. I thought that was a good piece of legislation. But remember, I've been presented now, I think at least twice, where we've been told in this committee and then in my other committee, in unclassified information, that 70 to 90% of the precursors or the source material for fentanyl comes to the United States first, and then goes over to Mexico, and then ends up coming back. So these are serious problems, but they demand serious approaches, and they demand people with expertise who actually know what they're doing. You know, really, nothing against people in their early 20s. I wish I was still in my early 20s. But you know, the people that have been put in charge of overseeing this have absolutely no background or no expertise to do it. With that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to these in writing pursuant to committee rules. All members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objections, this committee stands adjourned, and once again, thank you for your participation.